Chapter 10. Perry had just dropped his best friend's wife off at her home. He couldn't imagine life without Paul. Sue and Paul Jr. had been his friend's life and love. As a married father of 2 children himself, the thoughts of what would happen to his family of 3. Many times in the past he had thought of the dangers of his profession. There would not be a monetary problem, as his family would be well off, but emotionally how would they be if something happened to him? All the dangers that Perry had met as his life as a defense attorney who primarily handled cases of murder had crossed his mind. Della knew the dangers and had embraced them as his secretary. But, Sally and Perry Jr. had not had a choice. Once again he had come from danger unscathed. How many times had Paul faced danger and been unharmed? He had been alongside his friend often when they had discovered who the murderer was. Paul had been exposed to everything as a private detective. The dangers of their jobs were something that they had accepted. Going to a meeting at the lodge had always been considered a relaxing time, not a dangerous time. This event would have an immediate impact on him and his thoughts of safety for the rest of his life for sure. As Perry picked up the phone to call Della and let her know that he was going back to the lodge to meet with the police, he thought of her once more. Della was smart and his right arm. She was his life and his happiness. He would do anything for her or his family, and he wished that he could stay home for her on this night. But, he was going to find the men that had done this terrible deed, and he was going to find them tonight. Della came into the driveway of her home, and as she pushed the button to open the garage doors, the tears came. She had been strong for her friend Sue and would need to keep her composure for her children. Sally would be old enough to understand what had happened, and she knew that, although the thoughts would be unpleasant, it would be better for Sally to hear the truth from her and not from the television. Perry Jr. was too young and would not understand as well. He would be spared that for a while anyways. Karen heard the sound of Della's car as it went into the garage and thought of the pain that her employer and friends and liked Paul very much. He was funny and had always made her feel welcome. She wiped her tears once again. Sally had gone to bed worried about her Uncle Paul. He had been so much fun to be with and had taught her how to be a good swimmer. She loved to go over to the house and play with her friend Paul Jr. and hoped that everything would be all right. She couldn't sleep and had been looking out the window when her mom had driven in the doorway. Della was sitting in her car in the garage still when she was startled by the ringing of her car phone. She had been so busy crying and entranced in the memories of her friend that she had not been aware of her surroundings. As she reached for the phone and said hello, she heard the familiar sound of her husband's voice. "I am on my way back to the lodge to meet with the police. Della, I cannot leave or sleep until I find out who did this to Paul and my other friends. This is something that I need to do." Perry told her as kindly as he could. There was nothing more that Della wanted to do than to help Perry find out what had happened. But, she knew that someone needed to stay home with her family, and Sue needed her badly also. But, she needed to offer her services. This was a bad situation, and if he needed her she would be by his side as she had always been. For a moment Perry thought that he could use Della. She was his life, but he knew that his children needed their mother more at this time. Perhaps later she could come and assist him, but for now he was going to need her to help out with the family while he caught the murderer. He was now driving towards the lodge and knew that he had to keep his head. He was going to catch the murderers tonight if he could. Lt. Anderson was just finishing up his work at the lodge. There were now several dead and many injuries, some that were life-threatening. He was deeply saddened by the death of Paul Drake. Paul had always been a tough pie and had butted heads with him on a few occasions. But, he had known him to be an honest man with a family. It was just part of his work. Sometimes police work was very trying on the emotions. As he looked up he saw Perry Mason walk into the room. There were many times the two men had appeared to be on different sides of the road, but he knew that Perry had an amazing ability to get at the truth and he could use him now. Chris Washington had been there in the lodge when the shooting had begun. She had watched as the gunman had taken aim and shot her husband. He had gone back with such force that there had been a hole in the wall where his body had been slammed against. She had screamed and had seen the man that had shot him look her directly in the eyes. It was as if he was laughing or sneering at her as he had thought of shooting her. But he had not, he had turned and shot someone else. Why? For what reason was she spared? Why was he smirking at her, she thought to herself. Mark Washington had been badly wounded and was coming in and out of consciousness as he lay in the emergency room. He had been well aware that the shooter had looked directly at him and had shot him by taking careful aim. He couldn't figure out why he was alive. He was sure that his life was over. Once he had been shot, he could still hear the screams of the people. It had not gone the way he had expected. As he drifted back, he saw his wife walking into the room. Chapter 11. Chapter 11. Mary Pierce had now found herself in very deep trouble. Yes, she had organized many demonstrations against abortions and Planned Parenthood's determination to keep the procedure available to all with no restrictions. She had organized and attended so many demonstrations since the Roe v. Wade decision that had been made by the Supreme Court she had lost count. The demonstrations were getting more and more violent, and she had done her best to keep them peaceful. She had seen violence on both sides of the line and had been becoming more and more concerned over the last few months. There had been several changes in some of the states, and so the stakes were now higher than ever. Now, her worst fears had come true. As she watched the police officer walk back over to her, she cringed inside. He was there to find out all that she knew. As a demonstrator organizer, she knew things that they would wish. But, she was determined to give them as little information as possible. However, she needed to contact her attorney on this one. Until she spoke to him, she had no intention of saying anything. Lt. Anderson had dealt with Mary Pierce before. She was a tough cookie and very determined. He knew that she probably knew the two men who had done the shooting. He wondered if she had been the mastermind behind the plan. One fact he was sure of was that someone that belonged to the lodge had been involved. The two men had been allowed to enter the building by someone who belonged. You needed a guest card to enter and were allowed to take 2 guests. The men had also situated themselves in very strategic places. They were able to spray their bullets in every corner of the room without barely moving 1 inch. But, in Mary's defense, she had not been in the lodge when the shooting had occurred, and it was possible that she didn't know for sure who was involved. So, the best thing to do at this point was to arrest all the demonstrators and take them downtown to be interrogated. There were many people there and all would have to be questioned. He watched as more and more people were loaded into the police cruisers and taken downtown. As Lt. Anderson approached Mary, he thought he saw her quiver. Just a little, but he could see that she was nervous. This was a new one for her. She was usually the coolest, calmest woman he had ever met. "Hello, Mary. I have a couple of questions that I need to ask you," he said calmly. Mary looked at him with stern eyes and said, "I am sorry, Lt. Anderson, but I will speak to my attorney before I speak to you. This is the advice that I have given everyone that you have taken downtown for questioning. This is a mass shooting that none of us were involved in, and we need legal advice before we say anything." With that, she walked into the police cruiser that was waiting for her. Paul Drake Sr. was now on a mission. Someone had killed his son. Oh, he and Paul had always known the danger of their work. However, this had been uncalled for and should have been a simple night out with friends at his local lodge. Jen was so upset, and leaving her and his daughter-in-law Sue at his son's house had been one of the hardest things he had ever done. But, there were 2 killers out there, and he was going to find out who they were and bring them to justice. Nick Connors was at his home when he heard the news of the shooting at the lodge. He and his family had never belonged to it because they were just poor working slobs and had not felt as though they would be welcome at such a place. But, now he looked on in horror as he saw person after person being taken out to an ambulance on the television. He heard about the car that they were looking for, and he wondered about the sale he had just made 2 days ago to a man he had never met. They had given him $100 for a car that would not last long. It was an old '68 Falcon with over 100,000 miles on it. They had put a plate on it so that they could drive it home. He had turned his back on many questionable things, and as he had done before on that day, and allowed them to use one of his many old plates, that my name is Paul Drake. I am a private investigator and would like to please ask you a couple of questions. This was just what Nick needed. He knew that if this guy could find him, so could the police. He hadn't done anything wrong, though. But wait, Paul Drake, wasn't that the name of one of the victims at the lodge? He decided to keep cool and friendly. Good evening, my name is Nick Connors. He shook the man's hand confidently and waited for his response. I am looking into the car that the shooter at the lodge was driving. I see that you have several older models, and I was hoping that you might be able to assist me with anyone who has an older model Falcon or Fairlane in the years 1967 or 8. He watched the man carefully and was surprised to hear his response. I usually just mind my business, but this shooting was a terrible thing. It is true that I have several older cars here in my yard. Most of my cars are not in good enough condition to even drive the 2 miles needed to reach the Dodge. Certainly none of my cars could ever pass inspection. Just a couple of nights ago a couple of men came to me and asked about such a car, though. They left with one of my old plates and promised that they were just taking it a short distance. They said that they had plans to refurbish it. I had no reason to doubt what they said. Paul was surprised at his ability to still find things by instinct. He had found the car, perhaps. Were you going to check on the information in your office? He asked the man. As a matter of fact, I was on my way there exactly. I have the number of the plate that they were using, and I wanted to see if it would match some of the letters that the police are looking for. The two men walked towards the office and opened the door. There in the files was possibly the name of the person responsible for his son's murder. Fortunately for Nick, he did obey the laws that required an identification for the purchase of any vehicle. As he opened the folder, Paul Sr. looked down at the name and address of the man who had purchased the car. It was then that the two men peered at the plate number. The first 3 numbers matched the plate number that had been seen that night. Quickly Paul took down the information, thanked the man, and left. He had a name and address. Now onto the car and the man. Chapter 12. Mary Pierce had arrived at the police station once again. She was used to being there by now. How she, as a quiet non-violent woman, had gotten into such a violent occasion was beyond her understanding. She had always pledged non-violence and wanted to save unborn children. At no point had she ever condoned violence of any kind. Now, here she was in the middle of one of the worst mass shootings that had ever occurred. There was so much hate. Think, Mary thought to herself. She had been surprised by the crowd that night. Although the amount of demonstrators had been growing larger over the past few months, this was the biggest she had been involved with so far. She had arrived early that evening to find a gathering of 50 or more people there demonstrating. The meeting was not to have begun until around 7, so she had thought she was quite early, coming in at 5. There was a close group of friends who usually gathered together, and then some stragglers for the most part. She had been confined to the sidewalk and had obeyed the rules that night, as she had tried to do in the past. Yes, being arrested was one of the dangers of demonstrating. But she had always been charged with trespassing or disorderly conduct. She had always paid the fine and gone on with her life. Now, this was all going to change if she didn't act from her mind more than with her heart. Gladys Livingston was a lawyer that prided herself with her work. She was a strong supporter of the rights of individuals to demonstrate. She did not have a strong opinion on abortion one way or another, but she supported the right for people to demonstrate peacefully whenever they felt it was right. She had been getting ready to leave her office when her secretary had come in and told her of the shooting at the lodge. As she had turned on the office television, she had watched her very frequent client Mary Pierce being placed in a police cruiser. She headed right out to the police station. This was a bad thing, a very bad thing, and her clients could be in very big trouble. Paul knew that working by himself was very dangerous. He thought of his son's best friend Perry. His son had trusted him and had been his confidant for years. He picked up the car phone and called Perry Mason. "Perry, this is Paul. I have some information that you might find interesting." Perry had been at the lodge and had known that staying there would not solve who had done such an awful thing. He knew that the police would be very thorough and he wanted a quick end to the nightmare that seemed never ending. He had been pleased to have gotten a call from his best friend Paul's father. He had started the Paul Drake Detective Agency, and though he had been out of the business for many years, Perry knew he had been the best at one time. Perry looked around to make sure no one was listening to him, and he listened intently to the man on the phone. "Perry, have you ever heard the name Mark Washington?" Paul asked. This was a surprise. Of course, he had heard of Mark Washington. Mark was a member of the lodge and they had butted heads more than once. He was a very opinionated man with a loud voice. He had seen him that night and they had words also. "Yes, I know him." "Why?" he asked. "I have been out doing some investigation of my own. I thought of the older Ford that was seen picking up the two gunmen, so on an off chance I went to an old junkyard. There I met with the owner and found a man named Mark had purchased a Falcon just 2 days ago that matched the description of the car that they used. By law he has to have identification given before a vehicle is purchased, and that is the ID that was presented. But Mark had been one of the victims of the shooting. His injuries were not life-threatening, though, and Perry wanted to talk to him. He knew that the police would be right behind him and he was going to find and talk to him first. "I think that we should meet at the hospital. We should go and speak to Mark," Perry told him. "On my way. I can be there in just a few." And with that Perry said his goodbyes to the lodge and headed back to the hospital. His friend was barely cold and he was going to find out who had done this act of terrorism on his friends and family. Not only had these men killed Paul, but the lodge president had been among the victims. Perry and Della had just been at the lodge a month ago to celebrate he and his wife Donna's 25th anniversary. Mark Washington awoke to find his wife standing next to him. For a second he wasn't sure where he was. But then the memories of those awful moments came flooding back to him. He had been sitting in the audience next to his wife when all hell had broken loose. The two men that he had invited into the lodge that evening had brought guns and started shooting. It had happened so fast and he had no memory of coming into the hospital at all. He struggled to sit up. He had to warn her. He knew that she and his family was in danger. He knew the identity of the shooter and he might be the only one. If they would shoot up and kill in a public place, he was sure they would think nothing of killing more. Chris had been by his side since her husband had been shot. He was a hothead sometimes, she knew, but he had always been a good father and husband to her and had the best of intentions, so she had thought. She wondered about the secrecy that had been a part of their lives for the last couple of weeks. She wasn't sure of what he had been up to, but she knew he had something planned. He had been on the phone in his office when she had come in and hung the phone up so quickly that she was sure there was something that he didn't want her to know about. Now, she heard that an old Falcon had been seen picking up the alleged shooters. It couldn't be the ratty old thing her husband had brought home a few nights ago. The car was in terrible shape. But, still she needed to know. Were her and her family in danger from her husband's stupidity? As Mark was about to somehow warn his wife of the danger he had put her in, he looked up to see Perry Mason and an older gentleman walking into the room. By the stern looks on their face he knew this was not a social call. As Chris looked up to see Perry Mason, she knew her worst fears were founded.